The next presentation in the Lead Marketing Conference deals with the virtual reality and market research. Our speaker is Rich Scamehorn, Chief Research Officer for InContext Solutions. Rich, take it away.
Thank you, John. So I'm talking to you today about how virtual has enabled the ability to do a lot more iterative testing and better quality concept testing for market research. So I want to set the stage a little bit, talking about the environment that we're all playing in. And the biggest component of that is how quickly retail is changing and evolving. And we all have been talking and focusing on this in the industry. But the breadth of the change is pretty staggering. You know, if you look at just what the impact of online shopping has done, that's a huge difference in how we all operate and how shoppers acquire products. But that is just the start. There's so many more technological disruptions that have either occurred or are coming that are going to make a major impact in how retail plays out. So things like the frictionless store that is best exemplified at the moment by Amazon Go, opening stores where there are no checkout cashiers, you just are picking up the products and you're able to walk out of the store and not really have to deal with that transactional process as you're exiting the store. We have major mergers going on like Amazon and Whole Foods, where you have a major online retailer merging with a major brick and mortar retailer in perhaps a different vertical. And so how are all of those combinations going to impact how everybody else tries to compete with them? What does that enable a brick and mortar store to do? What does that enable an online store to do? Things like ordering online and picking up in stores. All of those kinds of changing and evolving shopping behavior are impacted as well by those kinds of changes. Then you have the disruptive kinds of online retailers that are companies like Brandless, depicted in the middle there is one of their kits, Dollar Shave Club, Blue Apron, all of these companies that are changing how sort of basic products in a CPG world are getting purchased and how their consumers are interacting with those brands is being impacted. Similarly, a company like Jet.com that's very focused on the brands part of it, but the delivery mechanism is very different than how it has been before. So all of this change is occurring in retail and how products are connecting to some of the most basic products that they purchase. And that has everyone in the industry trying to figure out how is retail changing and evolving and what do we need to do next to stay ahead of that change. But I can tell you that brick and mortar is definitely here to stay. After all of this disruption and conversation about online, still the vast majority of shoppers are preferring to shop in store. And that behavior is not going to go away. And we can see that because the recent NRF study was looking at the habits of Generation Z shoppers, so the youngest generation that we're currently tracking. And 67% of those shoppers, even the youngest, most tech-savvy shoppers, would shop in brick-and-mortar stores most of the time. So it's not that they don't want to shop in a brick-and-mortar store. It's not that they want to do everything online. It's just that they are interested in maybe some different reasons or rationales about that shopping experience than previous generations. They care about product quality, which previous generations very much did, but things like availability and convenience are much more important and are much more varied at this point in time with all of these other online channels that are available. But I think perhaps the most important thing that they care deeply about is the experience of shopping for things. They do want it to be a very interesting experience and personal if it can be. So it's more important than ever to be capturing the attention of shoppers, providing them with something that is more interesting and a more engaging experience in store if you want them to continue to come to your store or go to a store where your brand is sold. So those things are critical as we go forward, but they are also ever evolving. So it's important to stay abreast of what's out there, what's happening, and how can you work in your day-to-day work to try to find ways to make your brand or your retail store experience more interesting and engaging for shoppers. One of the challenges for all of us in the industry is leveraging the data that we have access to, and this recent study from JDA Suffer Group was pointing out that most people feel like they are not able to fully leverage the big data or the data that they have access to, that it's difficult to get from a lot of this data that they're collecting, and we are collecting ever more and more quantities of data, but how do we get that data to be something that becomes actionable is a big challenge for most brands and most retailers. And so finding ways to organize that information and quickly be able to make decisions from it and move forward with action is vitally important in these types of situations of vast and massive change. So ultimately, as we're designing how we want to make that experience better in store for our customers, ideally this would be a continuous and organic process, something where we have some foundational information of how people shop and would like to shop for the products that they are buying, and we want that to become more engaging and more compelling for the shopper over time, which again would drive them to choose your store or your brand's products, whether that's through a brick and mortar or through an online or through whatever channel you're competing on. How do you make that as engaging and as personalized as possible, and ideally do that in a way that every time you take an action or make a decision, that is giving you feedback and moving you in the continuous development and improvement process towards better and better experiences for the shopper. That's really the challenge here, is to set up your approach to learning about how shoppers want things to be and how new ideas and new concepts fit into that environment and drive better and better behavior for your brand or your retailer, and do that in a way that you learn from it and can then iterate on those ideas and continue to see that improvement as you follow that process.
We had a question come in, Rich. Yeah, Rich, we had a question come in regarding this slide here. What kinds of business issues can virtual testing be used for?
Thanks for that question. I think there are a wide variety of things that it can be used for, and I'm going to cover several of them today, but I'll hit the main ones. There's a lot of what I would describe as concept testing, which is the arrangement of the products on shelf, the assortment of the products, the pricing of the products in various combinations or scenarios within pricing, promotions, which include signage or displays or just price promotions on the shelf. Display testing in general can be done. Signage on its own can be done. And then things like foundational research, there's certainly a capability to do things like a decision tree methodology from a shopping exercise. So I'll give some more detail about some of those as we go along. But those are sort of, I forgot to mention packaging, which is another one. Sort of the basic thing I would say as to whether it's likely to be something you can do with virtual is it something that is visual in nature? So if the decisions impact what the visual is for the respondent or the shopper in store, that's probably something that we can use virtual to simulate. There are a few exceptions to that. And we can certainly talk about that if people want, but I think it's a lot of the visual environment that you are moving through and interacting with, whenever we're making shopper marketing changes to that environment, those are likely things that we can test using virtual. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay.
I'm going to move on to my next slide here and talk a little bit about the process that I was just describing, that sort of continuous loop process. It really starts with some foundational information about the category and how people shop, and utilizing that foundational information to ideate a variety of ideas for how you might improve that. So that usually revolves around one of those business issues I was just describing. You're trying to optimize your arrangement, or maybe you're doing SKU rationalization to optimize your assortment. Maybe it's around a pricing question or scenario. Whatever that business issue is, you can iterate some ideas or come up with some ideas through ideation. And then once you've established what those ideas would be in store, we can set those up for a virtual simulation and evaluate them by having online respondents come through and shop those scenarios and compare the behavioral results of how people shop those across the different scenarios, so that we're able to understand what the impact to sales behavior, other behaviors like where they go and how much time they spend in various parts of a section, and then attitudinal answers as well, where they would describe what their impact of that scenario they're experiencing is on their perceptions of how that category is arranged, if it's an arrangement question, or their perceptions of the brand, if it's a packaging or a pricing kinds of questions. All of those things are things that we have historically been able to ask in an attitudinal way, can also be asked at the end of a virtual shopping exercise that allows us to do a lot of evaluation of both the behavioral observational data along with the attitudinal data. Can usually give us a pretty good understanding of why that behavior is changing. And we know if we set the study up that the change that was made is the only difference between those scenarios, and so we can isolate the impact of that change. So that allows us to evaluate those ideas, and then we would move, assuming that we find an idea that is successful in growing our situation, our category, our brand, are usually the sales we're trying to grow. We can move on to an activation stage where we would use those same visuals and the results of that study to help convince the retailer to make that change, or all retailers to make that change eventually. And so you would then be able to get it on shelf and then see that impact that it's having in stores, and take back the information that you learned from those two things to start this process again and continuously do that loop to try and improve the experience and make it a growth situation for your brand and your category. If you're not able to identify one of the ideas that you did as growing the category, maybe they're all flat or some of them are unsuccessful in that, what you usually will do is find some kernel of usefulness from those ideas that you can perhaps iterate on and find a way to get to another idea that you can evaluate again and eventually find a solution that does drive growth. And we've been quite successful in helping clients find ways to iterate in this cycle of ideation, evaluation, until they find something that is successful, and then they can take that to activation and move it forward. So one of the things that has happened over the last 10 years in virtual simulation research that has been sort of changing how you can look at this is the ability to do that testing more quickly and more cheaply through a process or a tool we call indicators, which is really a standardized version of a questionnaire and a standardized output that allow you to be able to execute this more quickly. And that means that virtual reality can be that approach that is both all of fast, good, and cheap, not just 2 out of the 3, which is the proverbial way of describing all research, that they're usually 2 of the 3. And so let me talk a little bit about what that virtual reality simulation looks like and why it might be, with the use of indicators, something that hits all three of these things.
We have a question, Paul, that Rich that came in. How do your results from a virtual store indicator compare to in-store results?
Yeah, so the virtual store results have been shown to be very accurate relative to in-store results. Most of the comparisons are comparing side by side a virtual store test with a controlled store test executed in real stores, and showing that when the same conditions are maintained, what you will usually see is a correlation of the shares of the products in each of those two methods at 0.9 or higher, which means that the behavior that's going on there is very, very similar. The large products are bought by a large percentage in both studies. The smaller products are bought by a small percentage in both studies. The changes that you see that happen because of a change between scenarios are replicated in both methods. And so there's a very strong relationship to in-store results. Similarly, when you look at the outcome in real stores of real changes, when you're able to execute the way things were tested in a virtual environment, you do see those results coming back in a very similar, highly correlated way with what the results were in the virtual store test. Quite often, as we all are aware, the execution in stores is not ideal, and so there are some discrepancies that happen because of that change in execution quality that happens in store. Things like distribution and varying store layouts and impacts, the ability to actually make the change that you are testing in the virtual is often a bit muddied and muddled in the real world, and so that does cause some difference between what the results are, but they are things that all of you who are working on execution in stores would be fully aware of currently. And so really what the virtual test result is giving you is sort of that idealized state of what would happen if we could do this at all stores. And then you need to make those adjustments with what level of execution you know to be the reality of the situation. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay.
I'm going to move on to showing you a video here of what that looks like, if I can. And here we are going into the store, and the shopper would be placed in an aisle and be given a trip mission like this one, where they're to shop for juice as you would on a typical grocery store visit. And then when they're ready, they would click the button, and then they could go in, and they can move anywhere within the space that juice is in. They can pick up as many items as they want. They do that by just double-clicking on it like that. That brings the product out. They can rotate it in 360 degrees. They can, if they want to, zoom in on that fine print so they can read it. And they can either add it to their cart or they can put it back. And then ultimately, when they're done shopping, they can check out as they did there. So,
yeah, I have a question that came in, Rich, regarding the video.
Yep.
How critical is the realism of the shopping exercise to the quality of your results?
So the realism is important because that's really what we're doing here as a simulation approach. So things like doing it in 3D versus 2D do matter. The bigger your section is, the more products that you're doing, the less box-like your products are, the more important and critical it is to be doing things in 3D. If you're doing things with signage or displays that stick out into the aisle, they're just not well captured with the traditional shelf set tool. Whereas with a 3D tool like this one, they are well captured. It doesn't have to be a 3D online tool, although that does give you the ability to take advantage of all of the research advantages of online tools. So you get geographic dispersion, you get speed and less expensive respondents. So all those things are advantages when you're able to do it online. But the 3D part, the realism is important. The other part is they need to be able to see the package. They need to be able to read things when they're trying to look at them, and so they need a mechanism to be able to shop the way they like to shop. They need to be able to read the prices. They need to be able to read the packaging. And so all those things are important to have simulated well enough that they are able to behave the way that they would normally behave in a real store. And if you achieve that level of quality, then you're able to know that the shopping mechanism isn't causing some of what you're seeing for behavior. So for instance, in a 2D tool, some of the traditional ones, if you have more than 8 feet of shelf space, you might have to scroll the products onto the shelf. And unfortunately, that forces you to look at the shelf to know where you're at in the aisle, which is not true in a real store. In a real store, if I'm in the carbonated soft drinks aisle and I'm on the Pepsi end, I know the Coke stuff is on the other end. I can look 80 feet down the aisle and see the big red blob of Coke, even though I can't make out any of the packaging details, and know that's where the Coke is. And now I can walk that 80 feet without really looking at anything else on that side of the aisle. Maybe I'll look at the other aisle, maybe I'm thinking of other things and just looking at my cart, but I don't have to be actively engaged with the aisle to move down to the other end. And so that 2D scrolling mechanism is artificially inflating how much you're looking at in that aisle relative to that type of shopping behavior. So there are some advantages that are very demonstrable for higher quality realism. There are some things that maybe aren't worth the trade-off in terms of that quality because the incremental improvement in your data isn't large enough maybe to justify, but 3D I think is definitely justifiable, and I think the sharper resolution that you can get in that, the more likely people are to engage with the packaging and read it. So particularly when you're doing packaging testing, you're going to want as much realism as possible. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay,
I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about this iterative idea that I was in the title and started to talk about earlier. So one of the things that has been developed over the last 5-6 years is the ability to take a virtual reality system like this, and once you have engaged with a supplier to build out the content that enables that system to work, so the product images and the store environment, you can then execute the research in a very standardized way if you want to. Now, some questions you're going to want to have a more custom approach, and you're going to want to have more in-depth questions and analysis being done to help you answer your objective. But there's an option available where you could do what we call indicators that are a very quick way of using that standardized questionnaire and a scorecard output to get you results in a matter of a couple of weeks. So you decide you want to do the study, you verify that we have the environment stimuli that we need, you tell us what it is that you want to test, and with our software, Shopper MX, you can often create signage or arrangements or whatever it is that you might be changing. And then once you initiate that, we can get it into the field in a matter of a few days, as we just need to QC those changes you've made and make sure that that's going to work on the research. And then fields for 4 to 6 days usually, and then we're able to come back out of the field and put together that scorecard. And within a matter of a couple weeks, you have those results. And we can do this for all of those things I was talking about: arrangement, assortment, signage, displays, packaging, pricing, promotions are all possible to be done this way. We have a standard questionnaire for each one of those. It might not address 100% of the things that you would always want to, that your particular situation you want to address now, but it should be addressing most of the things that you would always want to address that are sort of consistent across all of that type of concept research. And so that allows you to do this very quickly and fairly cost effectively. So that speed and cost really enable what we wanted to talk about here, which is the ability to iterate. So because you're doing this very quickly, if you find out that the 4 concepts you came up with, none of them actually led to an increase, which For arrangements, what we have found long-term across all of our clients is that of all the arrangement tests that we've done, only about 15% of them have lifted the category. On the flip side, about 15% of them have hurt the category sales. And so the middle, 70% of that were flat to the category as it was currently set up. Now, you might think that's a really low percentage, but keep in mind, all of the people in category management for decades have been working to try and improve these arrangements and make them better. And so that's really just a reflection of how good of a job everyone has done in making them fairly efficient in helping people shop. But things continue to evolve, categories change, new products are introduced, and so there is some things that can be done, and occasionally we do find things, about 15% of the time, that will lift the category simply by how the products are arranged on the shelf. And that percentage varies from business issue to business issue in terms of how well those categories have been optimized. But the point there is that you might do a set of ideas and you might not see something that lifts the category. So what do you do in that situation? And our point would be that's something where you hope to learn something from those things that didn't work, that give you some kernels of ideas that allow you to ideate again and come up with some new ideas that you can iterate with and test again and do that process until you do identify some things that will lift the category. If you go through several iterations and you're not finding something, it may be that that's a business issue where you don't have as much opportunity for growth as you might have thought. Usually we have been successful in finding things that can lift the category if you continue to iterate and work through what you're learning from each of those situations. So to really start this process, though, you need a starting point. And for us, the starting point is some type of foundational research. Now, the last speaker was talking about shopper card data and how you can utilize that. That could serve as information that you have around how people shop a category. What we offer is a shopper decision tree, which is a shopper exercise-based approach to creating a decision tree. Other methods for creating a decision tree might work as well. You could take a tree you've already built, and the point is that you need to take that as your foundational knowledge about how people shop a category. And if you're trying to do shopper marketing to your customers and the end users, then you really need to try and ideate based on that understanding of how people shop a given category, ideas that you think will help them do that in a more effective way. So one of the things for arrangement, for instance, is to try to make the arrangement be intuitive to people, so the products that they find substitutable for one another, having them arranged relatively close to each other in some form of arrangement that is consistent with how they group the products, is likely to help them navigate that section more quickly. And one of our outcomes has been that we have done some studies that showed that the faster that you can make that initial purchase, the more likely you are to add to your purchases from that category. And if it takes you a long time to find what you're looking for on the first product, then you tend to move on to another category or elsewhere in the store without buying additional products. If you think about the larger shopping trip that people are on, they have a limited amount of time and a large number of categories that they're doing if they're doing a stock-up trip. And so for those types of trips, they tend to buy a lot of products on autopilot, that they buy the same brand and same product all the time to save time for the few products and categories where they really aren't sure what they want to buy and they want to spend a little time sorting through the options that they would consider and making a choice. And so if your category can take less time for them to find things, there is going to be more time for them to apply to other things. And if they feel like they found it really quickly, they may look around there for new products or new ideas of things they might be interested in. And we've been able to show that behavior does happen pretty consistently.
Okay, Rich, another question came in here regarding that slide. What kind of virtual exercise is your shopper decision tree methodology based on?
Sure. So I described that, or showed you the video of the shopping exercise that we would typically use for most of the concept testing approaches. In the shopper decision tree, what we're trying to get at is switching behavior. And so the way we have utilized the virtual simulation for that is we send them on a shopping trip. They go in and they find the item that they want and they put it in their cart. And as soon as they put that first item in their cart, we end that exercise and bring them back to where they started, ask them to do that same exact shopping trip as though they had not done the first, and again, use the same trip mission. And as they go in to shop that second time, the item they picked from the first one is out of stock. It's off the shelf. And so they don't have that choice. And so they are not told that that's going to happen, but they then have to react, and we observe what they do. Do they switch to a different product from that brand, from that price range, from that size, that flavor? What is it that they choose as a substitute? And then they also have the option to leave the store and not buy something, so that would be similar to the walk rate that was described in the last talk. And then they would do that a third time as well. And so we get switching behavior, both direct and indirect, between the various products in that category based on that shopping exercise. And that allows us to get the information we need to build a decision tree. We actually use a way of describing those groups of products through the attitudinal questionnaire, where they're describing, of the items that they bought, try to describe that with 3 words, and then we're able to utilize that information to really understand why they substituted one product for another in their words. And so we don't assume any attributes, which leads to the ability to have non-symmetric trees like the one you're seeing here, and that the descriptions of what those product groupings are is completely identified by the respondents' attitudinal answers. So we're not making any assumptions about how they should be arranged in that tree. It's all based off of their description and their substitution patterns. So that's how we do the shopper decision trees.
Okay.
So let me walk you through a case study on how this whole process iteration can work. So again, you need a starting point. And so this case study starts with a shopper decision tree study. And this CPG manufacturer had a smaller, fragmented, and evolving category. And they really wanted to make an impact with their retailer partnership. They weren't a category captain, and they wanted to get more conversation going and bring more information to that retailer to try and get considered for that in the future. And so while they had a tree, it was a very standard type of tree like the one you see on the left. And it didn't actually capture a lot of the nuances of what was happening with that situation, a smaller, evolving category with a lot of newly introduced products. And that's quite true for a lot of these categories where a lot of disruption is happening. And if you go back to the beginning of this presentation, there's a lot of disruption going on in a lot of different channels. And so those types of situations, having a new tree that was based off and can capture a lot of what's happening with those smaller products, can be really important. And so that's what we did for them. We did a shopper decision tree approach, and it really identified some interesting nuances about based on which benefit was being focused on with a given SKU, how important the brand was in deciding which product to buy relative to the form or type of the product. And type and form was really only important if it was delivering benefit number 2 and for some of the brands. Otherwise, the branding became the more important driving factor in deciding which product they were going to buy. So that was very different than what they had heard before, where brand was the most important thing completely, and it didn't really matter what level of product they were in. So they were able to take that, and the next step after having those tree results was to really go deep with them in a workshop sort of fashion to ideate on how should these products be arranged to capture this information about how people were shopping the category, and how would they change that. So they developed some concepts based on that, identified 4 new ways of arranging things. So they did a 5-cell virtual store evaluation of that and compared those different situations. And a couple of them were directionally better than the current, but none of them were significantly better than the current. And so that really wasn't the kind of growth message they were hoping for. And so we took what we learned from those two that were somewhat successful, but not completely successful, and a little bit of information from the ones that were flat with the current completely, and tried to iterate on this and come up with some additional concepts. And they were able to do that and then retest those, and in that set of two new ideas, they were able to find one that lifted the category significantly and lifted their brand sales, and so was very successful for everyone involved. And they were able to take that back to the retailer and get that change to happen through utilizing some of the imagery from the shopping exercise as well as the results of that study, and really told the whole process of all the things that they were looking at, and found why, and were able to show from the decision tree why the idea that they came up with should be successful, and from the evaluation results that they had demonstrated that it was successful in a virtual context and therefore should be successful in the real world. And they were able to get buy-in from the retailer to go forward with that. It was very successful. They then rolled that out to several other retailers, and that's now the primary way that this category is arranged in most retailers. So a very successful application of this process of iteration. So my last slide is going to be another example. This one is on a display and looking at different display options. And in this case, the client was looking at trying to improve category shoppability in the carbonated soda beverage world. They looked at some good, better, and best display options. And by good, better, and best, it really was talking to the complexity and appeal of the displays visually. And obviously had different price points in terms of how expensive it was to execute each of these different options. So we did a couple of things here. We first evaluated them with a tool called VAA, Visual Attention Analysis, to try and understand if they were going to get people to look at those displays more often and differently. And then did some iteration on the ideas to try and maximize that breakthrough with the eyeballs. And then with those final ideas went into the evaluation project and was able to show that, in fact, the good concept actually drove more sales than the best concept did. And so they went forward with the good display concept. And with that $10,000 spend on the indicator test, they were able to choose a display that cost the company $400 less per store to create and implement. And with the number of stores across the country, about roughly 2,500, they saved $1 million in total, and were able to show that they got better sales results than they would have with that more expensive version. So it's a good way of showing how a little bit of iteration and a little bit of ability to test different versions allows you to find something that can maximize your return on investment as you roll out. And because it's measuring sales data, it's very easy to put it into that return on investment sort of metric. So again, if there's one key takeaway from what I talked about today, it's that with the advent of these standardized approaches for virtual research, once you have built that set of product images in the store and you're ready to go, those indicator type of approaches, standardized approaches, can enable more concept testing and iteration with insight about why you need to do that iteration to achieve a better final concept with greater ROI and leads you to make better decisions than you would if you didn't have that approach. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Are there any other questions?
We don't have any more questions in the chat box right now, Rich. Our attendees asked them along the way, which is our preference. But going forward, if attendees do have questions, your contact information is on the screen right now. You can reach out to Rich directly. There's his email address. And I thought that was well done, Rich. I thought I had a handle on virtual reality and market research, but frankly, I learned a lot, which is a good thing, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.